Okay, hi everyone. The final subtopic in topic 13, work physiology, is on physical workload measurement. In, I think, topic 8, we talk about mental workload and assessing mental workload via various, subjective measures, objective measures. Similarly, we have physical workload that we can isolate and have our own, different types of measurement techniques. Okay, so I mentioned in one of the earlier subtopics, or both the earlier ones, that we'd start talking numbers in terms of how many calories of energy might be required to do certain types of work. So again, we want to consider our at-rest, minimal, laying down, being as lazy as possible, our basal metabolism, our basal metabolic rate. That is always the lowest level. So we need a certain amount of caloric intake, if that's, otherwise it could be body storage, like body fat. But we consume, about, what is it? About 1,200 kilocalories. What is this? 1,800. Ooh, look at this. For a young man, I guess it would be 1,800 kilocalories per 24 hours. So that's just to sustain yourself, right? Okay, interesting. For a 165-pound man. So fortunately, I can eat more because I'm larger than that. All right. So women are slightly less, and as we age, BMR decreases our basal metabolic rate. We have less high-powered machines going, as far as our biological machines, our bodies, as we age. All right, so additional energy. So if you want to talk about levels of activity above a basal metabolic rate, you can have these, you can think of it as in multiples of that BMR. So sedentary but alive, that's probably this guy, 1.2. Oh, look at this. Okay, I didn't do the math on that, but this is roughly 1.2 kilocalories per hour, doing the basic minimum, all the way up to 6 kilocalories per hour, 7.5 kilocalories per minute. I guess what I'm talking about is doing these levels of activities for a minute, or per minute. So for 24 hours to, have a heavy activity level day, so if you're training for the NFL, you're probably in these later ranges because you're burning that many, calories in your daily activities. Okay. All right, so this chart here is going to be useful for any assessments, which could include a quiz, could include the final exam. So first of all, we have to make a big assumption here, and I'm sorry, ladies, but if we're talking about physical labor, most of the data we have is about young male workers. Of course, women can of course, perform the same types of tasks. It's just, these are the data we have, and physiologically men are different than women. So anyways, the data for healthy young males, you can look at this chart here, and we have some corrections slightly, for older males and for females. But this is an interesting, sort of association. If you can talk about subjective load, I'm working, a light workload, moderate, heavy. If I'm reporting that, maybe that's sort of, within ranges here, we have some correlations here with the oxygen content, or the oxygen consumed. So if we can somehow measure oxygen consumed per minute, we might have a pretty good idea about the level of workload sustained. We also might get these data from heart rate. And this is roughly the energy expenditure rate that we might assume. So this chart, you can relate a lot of these different measures. Subjective, oxygen, what is the nature of the work if you could actually measure it with a calorimeter or whatever, activity meter, and heart rate. So what's interesting here is, now if we apply this to the workplace, and we've got an 8-hour shift, for example, if the average work rate is less than or equal to 5 kilocalories per minute for a healthy young male, that's roughly considered, like an acceptable load if we're trying to estimate how much rest time. But by the way, this is not a legal, again, I think I said this in the previous subtopic, there's no legal standard here. This is just kind of, hey, rule of thumb, if you want to have effective, relatively happy, relatively, well-rested workers. So healthy young males, 5 kilocalories per minute, averaged over an 8-hour shift. That is, like that's a long day. That is the max that we kind of want to design for. And for females and older males, 3.5 kilocalories per minute. And the reason for this difference here is because of this association with these levels and, oxygen being associated with heart rate. And this is all like a big approximation, but we do know that the volume of oxygen exchange per breath for females and the uptakes of about 70% of males, healthy young males, in terms of per unit time. So that's how that conversion is made. All right. So the tip top 100% of what I can do is defined by this concept we call the MPWC, the maximum physical work capacity. I'm gonna, when you're ready, give me as much strength as you can. A lot of times it's done with this grip strength meter here. It might be with full body muscle, larger muscle groups and weights, etc. But we can determine here's the absolute maximum that I can produce with my muscles, right? Then once we have that defined, if we can then reduce, like approximate what 33% of that would be, then that is our kind of design point for a continuous work over an 8-hour shift. So we don't want people, at times I might have to really grunt, but if we're talking about the average here, this is where we do have some authority. NIOSH in 1981 says, 33% is our design standard here for what people can physically produce. Let's not average more than a third of that over 8 hours. And this is where we came up, or they came up with these numbers here. So average caloric, I should say the energy output, and therefore the number of calories of energy that have to be considered. 5 kilocalories for healthy young males, 3.5 for anyone else, basically females, young or old, and older males. So consider that there are going to be some jobs where, you gotta oomph for a little bit. So my example is, let's unload the truck. Unloading the truck is usually, a brief period of higher, demands of work, and then, but it's not over the entire course of the shift. So we have a slightly higher thresholds there, 9 kilocalories, 6.5. I've got these highlighted in purple. These are the ones I'm going to want you to use for any sort of test, any sort of quiz that might come from this. So yeah, it's all about, this is just kind of a rule of thumb. Here's where we can start. And this is, again, there's no legal association here. This is just what's a good rule of thumb to keep our workers effective and happy. And, okay, yep, that's where our 33% comes from. So, you can have people work close to their absolute maximum output, but for a short period of time. If it's push as hard as you can against this wall for 8 hours, that's not going to fly. That's going to lead to injury. It's not going to be effective. It's going to have unhappy workers. Okay, yes, and this is one of those consequences of pushing things beyond these recommended thresholds here. So if we exceed, 30 to 40% of our aerobic capacity, in other words, 33%, that's the other, that fits into this narrative here, over 8 hours. That's when we have, one of the consequences could be this whole body fatigue. So I think we all know what it means to be fatigued, but if you think about, this is something that's studied, and hey, is that what's the mechanism for this? It's not well known yet. We just know I feel tired, I feel fatigued, potentially over my whole body, when I exceed this level of activity. And one way you could think about that is lactic acid building up. Aerobic metabolism couldn't keep up over the course of the day, so there's a certain oxygen debt or lactic acid sort of content that you're working against, and that's going to, of course, contribute to feelings of fatigue. So what are the effects here? All of these: I'm tired, I'm sore, I can't quite produce the same level of force. I'm sleepy. If you were to look at my blood workup, I'd have lower levels of blood sugar, blood glucose, probably higher levels of lactic acid in the blood. So consequences, unhappy workers. It's not illegal to make people tired. It just makes them not like their job, makes them ineffective at the end of the day, and that's just not a healthy work environment for the general, in general. And there are ways that engineers could modify the schedule, modify the number of people, modify the rotation of the job, whatever, to make this easier. Engineering solutions, even better here. And so, find ways where if it's physical labor that's being performed by a human, does it make sense, even if it costs a little bit, to invest in some mechanical aids, for example, like a rolling conveyor here. So we no longer have to have humans support the weight of these things to deliver them to different locations. We push them along this surface, and we're making use of simple machines here. And then another thing to think about is, well, how much rest should we give our workers, or alternatively, how much of a worker's shift should be done in really easy, low impact sorts of activities versus these more heavy work activities. And we have some math for it. So the Morel formula, scientist named Morel, proposes this, and it's essentially a ratio that depends on the level of activity that's required for a certain task. The higher the kilocalories per minute the activity demands, the more rest time is basically recommended here with this formula. So, all right, so if T of S or TS is the total amount of time I'm working, let's say 8 hours, 480 minutes, right? And you can say I'm working heavy labor, and we might even go back to the first. Let's go back to this slide, this guy here, for some examples of you have to convert it to kilocalories per minute, but looking at the level of output that you might need to sustain certain activities. Sorry. And so we'll have that in kilocalories per minute. S is these constants we've talked about now. So it's kind of that limit of the aerobic capacity. Sometimes it's referred to. It's the limit of energy output that can be supported by aerobic metabolism. So again, that's 5 kilocalories per minute for healthy young males. Everybody else 3.5. By the way, if I were to ask a quiz or exam question that made it clear that there weren't any physical restrictions, this has hit my entire working population, which includes women. I probably wouldn't say which includes old people, because everybody's potentially there. So if I don't explicitly say healthy young males, pretty good idea to assume 3.5 as your standard there, just to be clear on that. All right, 1.5 is our resting energy expenditure. That's where this number comes from. That is my approximate basal metabolic rate. And we're solving for TR, which is the total amount of rest time. So a good example here is we're on the Titanic. We're doing heavy labor, shoveling coal. This is something intense. So I might tell you, hey, this is somehow determined to be 8 kilocalories per minute. I might instead say, by the way, ring, 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 I might instead say somebody was wearing a heart monitor, and the heart monitor shows us this level of cardiac activity while they're shoveling coal. Then I want you to make sure you go back to this chart, workload chart. And if I said, hey, let's say their heart rate was 125 beats per minute, or maybe safer thing to 115 beats per minute while they were doing this activity, you could reasonably say, okay, assuming a healthy young male, 115 beats per minute falls right here. We're going to say that's roughly in line with moderate workload. And then here you go. Now you could do some linear interpolation if you wanted to. But to determine what is roughly the kilocalories per minute of energy expenditure. So I could either tell you that directly, it's 8 kilocalories per minute, or I could give you heart rate, or I could give you oxygenation absorption rate, if I could measure that somehow. So you can kind of equate each of these in this table. So mark this table on slide 4 there. All right, going back to our example. All right, so 8 kilocalories per minute, I'm giving it to you here. I could have just as easily said, you know, whatever, 130 beats per minute in a cardiac meter. That would be, you could make assumptions. We're talking the same thing here. So if we are talking a healthy young male as our worker here, our shoveler, we're going to use the Morel formula, 480 minutes for 8 hours. I multiply that by 8. So let me just go back to it. Here it is. Oops, sorry. 8, which is the degree of energy expenditure I'm required, my M there, right there. S, being healthy young male, is going to be our 5 kilocalories. And that's all we need to know. So 8 minus 5, 8 minus 1.5, 222 minutes. So my answer here is over an 8-hour shift, 222 of those minutes should be not shoveling. Now, whether that's go and take, you know, a break in the break room, it really just means a break from this level of intense physical activity. Okay. Yeah, so about 46% of the shift should be not shoveling. So you've got 54% of an 8-hour shift, people are shoveling. So you say if we need, you know, one full continuous shoveling level of effort, you could say, well, each one is good for 54% of the job. So you need 2 of them to get to 100%. And similarly for women, you know, you would have a different number, or older men. 3.5 is the different number here. So if it's anything but healthy young men, it's 3.5. This says, all right, 69% of the time we need to be resting. You know, in other words, we need that many more people, you know, to be able to have a continuous, to have our workers healthy and have a continuous feed of, you know, or continuous activity on this task. Okay, just like we talked about with topic 8, there's a lot of different ways to assess cognitive workload. There are, you know, objective measures, you know, such as performance on a test. There are subjective measures such as NASA TLX. There are physiological measures. Similarly, for physical workload, there are some metrics, some measures that we can rely on if we want to measure how hard is somebody working. So first, and these are my favorite, the objective measures that use physiological data, such as oxygen intake. So what you see here, this guy, if you can imagine measuring the, you know, the oxygen content of the inhaled air and the oxygen content of the exhaled air, the difference is going to mean that's the amount of oxygen absorbed by the body, and therefore the amount of oxygen that is used in aerobic metabolism. So you can pretty precisely estimate somebody's kilocalorie, you know, per minute or rate of energy expenditure based on their oxygen consumption. So that's pretty interesting. Of course, we know there's also anaerobic metabolism, so that's going to mess with the exactness of this. But we can also estimate anaerobic sources by looking at how long it takes somebody to recover after, you know, a workout. So the oxygen debt that's developed over the course of the work, you can to some extent determine how long it takes them to calm down is going to determine how much anaerobic metabolism took place during that activity. All right, so we got oxygen measures. We can also look at heart rate. This is probably the more familiar, more commonly used metric if you're determining what are my workers doing. Are they, are they over my design sort of goal here for their energy expenditure in these tasks? So heart rate is more susceptible to external inputs than oxygen. So for example, emotional states, certain levels of stress, also certain, you drink coffee, your heart rate, caffeine is going to elevate your heart rate as well. And everybody has a different sort of, what resting versus, working hard looks like in terms of their heart rate. So there's a lot of differences between people. Not as much the case with oxygen. Oxygen is pretty consistent. Just, kind of equivalent or the analogy to the NASA TLX as the most, NASA TLX, the NASA Task Load Index, metric being probably the most often applied cognitive workload assessment. The Borg ratings of perceived exertion, RPE scales, are probably the most familiar, most often applied physical workload scales. Now, there's only one scale here, and actually there's two versions of one scale, but that scale is just one dimension, is physical exertion, not like NASA TLX where we have several different dimensions. But this case, the physical exertion is actually in its original form, this original Borg scale, B-O-R-G is the scientist, in 1960. The scale went from 6 to 20, and this was basically designed to correlate to 60 to 200 beats per minute of heart rate. So with heart rate being a fairly reliable indicator of physical workload, this is a subjective scale that's designed on the same sort of extremes there. So 1960s version, and for a long time this is what was used, subjective ratings of 6 to 20. So if I'm doing this exercise, and I would call that somewhat hard but not quite hard, maybe that's a rating of 14, and maybe if you took my heart rate, it might be pretty close to 140 beats per minute. Of course, that's making grand simplifications across people and everything. A later updated version, 1985, said this this 6 to 20 scale is kind of awkward. Let's translate it back to a 0 to 10, something that makes a little more sense for most people's ratings of workload. And found the correlation to be pretty high with the measured heart rate. So it's not obviously a factor of 10 anymore, but still a strong correlation with this scale. And what you see today is a whole bunch of different sort of reimaginations, reinterpretations of what 0 to 10 mean in terms of perceived workload. So here are 3 examples. But generally, there are verbal description, like very light, and I'll give you an example. It doesn't even feel like you're exercising. That'd be a 1. And something that is very difficult to maintain your intensity. You can barely breathe, barely speak, but you could. All right, that's a 9. So there's these verbal descriptions anchor some of these ratings. All right, folks, that's it on topic 13, work physiology. Congratulations. Have a nice rest of the week.